welcome to another edition of AP's Profiles in Christian Living. My special guest with me this morning is Professor Nancy Pearcey. Nancy is a professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University and the author of many books, Love Thy Body, Total Truth, Finding Truth, among many others. And the book that we're going to talk to you about today is The Toxic War on Masculinity: How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. So a very timely and you might want to say spicy topic. Nancy, welcome. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you so much. And yes, it has been spicy, so I appreciate that.
Now, Nancy, you're something of a polymath, I must say. All your books I deeply appreciate for the level of research that you put in. There's always great history, sociology, Bible, so much so that I often find myself flicking to the footnotes and thinking I need to follow up that footnote. That's an excellent reference. This book in particular is, I found, probably, can I say, one of your most personal because of your own upbringing. Could you reflect back to the listeners just what I mean by that?
Yes, I did start the book with the story of my own childhood. I grew up in a very abusive home. My father was severely physically abusive. In books on abuse, they will sometimes ask, was it open hand or closed fist? And it was closed fist, definitely, with the knuckle fist to create a sharper stab of pain. And so, well, what it does in my perspective is, of course, here's how one psychologist put it. He interviewed me and he said, well, at least we know you're not writing from an ivory tower. We know that you're writing from the trenches. So as I put it in the introduction, in a sense, I've been writing this book my whole life because I have had to really, on a personal level, work out what is a truly biblical, positive, healthy view of masculinity. So you're right. In that sense, it's very personal. And I even tell the story of how I got healing, because that's the next question people ask me, right? How come you're not bitter? Because the book does not come across as bitter and angry. And the answer is that it actually was part of my conversion experience. So I became a Christian. I'd given up my Christian faith in high school. I was raised as a Lutheran. I don't know if you know this, but all Scandinavians are Lutheran. And my parents were Scandinavian. So it's kind of an ethnic religion. And I gave it up in high school. And I ended up, over time, I ended up at the ministry of Francis Schaeffer in Switzerland, which is called Liberating. And I ended up there because I had lived in Europe when I was a child and I had gone back. But at any rate, it was apologetics that blew me away at first, because I had never encountered any Christians who could engage with the secular isms, the secular philosophies, the secular worldviews that I had absorbed by that time, and who could show that Christianity had reasonable answers, solid, good arguments, good logic, evidence. So it was the apologetics that really was the reason I converted then back to Christianity. But, and I've told that story in a couple of my books. What I haven't told is a story of how at Liberating I also started on the journey of emotional, psychological, and spiritual healing from my abusive childhood. On staff at Liberating was a psychiatric social worker. Her name was Sheila Bird, and we called her Birdie. And she was the one who helped me to realize that you can't just walk away from your past. When I left home, I tried to just make a blank slate. I was going to wipe out my whole childhood and rebuild my whole self from scratch. That's what I thought I could do. Well, you can't do that. And so through Birdie, I experienced a quality of love and a deep probing understanding of all the childhood trauma. And so, looking back, I'm just amazed that my Christian life started out with that balance of the intellectual input from Liberating, and then the spiritual emotional healing that started at Liberating as well. So I'm very grateful for that.
In fact, there's this great picture. I might just hold it up for the screen in your book. This is you. I love this picture of you, that the woman in the middle there. And it's so striking because it just captures, I think, where you were at emotionally, spiritually at that time. And then just below this, you talk about how you'd come to chapel that day, Francis Schaeffer was about to preach, and you walked out of chapel because you were just hungry just to hear a word from God. And Bertie actually opened up Psalm 27, verse 10. For my father and mother have forsaken me, or though my father and mother have forsaken me, the Lord will take me up. And I thought, what a beautiful promise. And you can see that fulfilled in your life going on from there, that God's been faithful to that promise, yes?
Yes, yes. The way I understood it, of course, was that my mother and father have forsaken me in the sense that they had not fulfilled my emotional needs, but the
Mm,
Lord will. The Lord will
yeah.
fill up those empty spaces in your heart. And by the way, I would add one other thing: is it's not that I went outside because I was hungry for a word from the Lord. I went outside because I was scared to death. It was
Sorry.
right before I was going to go home.
Yep. Yeah.
It is a little different overtone. I was going to go home in a few weeks, and I was very frightened of seeing my father again. So
Yeah.
that's why I was so distressed. I couldn't even sit through Francis Schaeffer's sermon. So
Yeah.
that's the the emotional tone there was panic.
Yeah.
But
Sorry.
that's why
Thank
that
you
verse
for
was so
correct.
important to me then, because it really, and the irony is this. So when I got to church that morning, well, it was called the chapel at Libri. I got to the chapel and I said, "Oh, I'm so scared of going home." And I opened the scripture and I said, "Lord, please show me something from scripture that will speak to this." And I
Mm,
opened up sort of randomly to a psalm. I got about halfway down and I thought, "This isn't speaking to me. This doesn't work." And then when I went outside, it turned out that Psalm 27 was exactly the verse that I had opened to, of the chapter. It was the chapter I had opened to. I just hadn't finished reading it. The verse was further down, so I had slapped the Bible shut before I got down to the verse that was actually going to speak to me. And so God had to essentially send somebody out and say, "Hey, she didn't catch that verse. Would you please go out and show it to her again?"
yeah.
So
That's
it was one of those
fantastic.
God things that was really, really special.
Yeah, that's just beautiful. My own wife, when she got converted, she went to L'Abri in London, and she was really blessed through that. And interestingly, too, I got converted through the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church in California when I had a scholarship to go. So interesting cross paths. But back to you and your book. Um, I was really, I was really struck by the end of your book, just by the pain of dealing with domestic violence in the church. I myself am a pastor. Lots of people listening to this will be in pastoral ministry. You talk about a lot of the unhelpful ways that women in particular that are being abused are just told to submit and to go back to their abuser, and how profoundly unhelpful that is. And how important I think church discipline is, particularly in keeping men accountable. Nancy, what are some of the ways you've seen that done well, of terms
Well, let
of
me start
keeping
with
men
the way
accountable?
that it. Right. I'll start with the ways that it has not been done well, because you're seeing a shift right now. So up until recently, most books on abuse, most pastoral advice was what you just said. They tended to make it the woman's problem. She was responsible for fixing it. If you would just submit more, if you would just love more unconditionally, if you would just forgive more, if you would just have sex more, if you would make his favorite foods, if you would lose weight and look better. And these are all examples I have in the book. Many of these are actual, examples from people that I interviewed. Um, but the idea was that it's really up to the woman, and unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. It's not human nature. If a person truly is sinning, if somebody is sinning, if they are abusive, if they are a bully, we know that acquiescing and trying to placate them doesn't work. In all of the situations, we recognize this, whether it's a playground bully, right, or whether it's a belligerent nation in international affairs. We know that just placating and appeasing does not change the bully. And so somehow that was not applied to marriage. But fortunately, I wrote this book at the right time, because there are just recently books starting to come out by Christian therapists and Christian theologians who are saying, actually, the answer to abuse is what Jesus told us in Matthew 18. It's Jesus' own words, right? Matthew 18, if somebody's sinning, the correct response is to call him to accountability. And if he doesn't listen to you, bring a couple other witnesses. And if he doesn't listen to them, bring it before the church. And if he doesn't listen to them, that might be a time for church discipline. So I'm very happy to say that more and more people are starting to recognize that abuse is best dealt with by holding the abuser accountable, which statistically is usually the man, not always, but predominantly the man. And so, I do think that if you want to get good resources, read my end notes. I was so happy to find good resources on this subject. There are a
Mm.
lot more now than there were just a few years ago when I was first starting to research this.
Yeah, and look, your research is so thorough. I mean, you can really tell that you are a scholar in residence because I think that's one of the real strengths of your book is, well, not only I was thinking about this. There's three things that really struck me that is great about your book. Number one, the depth of research. Number two, I think the way you write and it's just so clear, and I really appreciated the subheadings, which were like little mini essays that just kept you going like stepping stones across the stream. You getting across the whole stream, you might feel too overwhelming, but just one step at a time was really good. But then just I think the breadth of research that you've done was really, really helpful. For instance, you talk about Darwinian sexism and how that's played into the views of men and women. Um, for those who haven't read the book yet, can you give us a summary of what you found in that regard?
Yeah, I'm glad you focused on that because I think it's one of the most important chapters in the book. So in the book, I am, as you know, I'm an apologist at heart. And so my main goal really is to show what's wrong with the secular view of masculinity. How did the secular world get its view of masculinity so wrong? And you
Mm.
cannot really stand against a social trend unless you understand where it came from and how it developed. And so I do show how the secular view of masculinity developed over time. And the rise of Darwinian evolution was a huge step in that process. And most of us don't know that because we think evolution is about controversies over, genes and fossils and so on. But it
Yeah.
actually had a huge impact on Western society's view of masculinity. So Darwinian thinkers began to say that the men who won out in the struggle for survival would be men who were ruthless, rugged, brutal, savage, barbarian, and sexually predatory. And so this is your true nature. If you want to get in touch with your authentic self, whereas Christianity had urged men to live up to the image of God in them, Darwinian thinkers urged men to live down to the animal nature within. The beast within was one of their favorite phrases. Um, and so, and so, what they were saying is, this is your authentic self. And by the way, Darwin also did explicitly argue that women were intellectually inferior to men. So he bears some responsibility for that part of the secular script as well. But it's not just historical because so that was called social Darwinism. Today it's come back under a new label. It's called evolutionary psychology. But it means the same thing. It means if your body and brain have evolved, that will still have all your ideas, all your feelings. And I'll give you two examples. One of them is a best-selling book. I underline best-selling, so it's had a lot of impact. It's called The Moral Animal. And the author says the human male is an oppressive, possessive, flesh-obsessed pig. Giving him a book on how to have a better marriage is like giving a Viking a book on how not to pillage.
Mm.
So I thought, well, that's okay. Now we're finding out what the message of evolution is to men. And then I also have another example. It's an older book, but that's just been reissued by George Gilder called Men in Marriage. And he too says men are by nature um, vicious, violent, irresponsible, sexually predatory, etc. And by the way, he adds, and it's up to women to tame them then. To which I say, if men were really that violent and that brutal, what woman would be able to change him and what woman would want to change him? But at any rate, this is the message that evolution has really inserted into our culture. And I think it's the main reason we have the phenomenon, for example, of Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate right now is
Yeah.
giving young men the idea that masculinity is fast cars, fast money, fast girls, and and unfortunately, he's won quite a following.
I'm so
I
glad
think
you
that
raised that.
looking at how how we got there.
I'm
Yeah,
so glad you raised that example because I wanted to actually ask you about that specific example of Andrew Tate, who seems to be taking the world by storm, influencing a lot of young men. Do you see Andrew Tate as personifying that Darwinian view of masculinity?
yes. I don't know if you've heard him give interviews because he uses the word God, but he clearly does not have a Christian worldview. And he's being prosecuted in Romania for sex trafficking because he does run an OnlyFans business, and he has women working for him, and he first seduces them and gets them to think he loves them, but then on tape he has literally said, "These women think I love them. Of course I don't. I'm just using them to get rich." So that's his attitude, and I do think that the reason we need to go back and look at the Darwinian impact is, yes, that's exactly what Andrew Tate exemplifies. And I
Yeah,
have to tell you, I'll add an anecdote here. I recently heard from a former graduate student of mine who is now teaching high school, and she said all our male students are fans of Andrew Tate.
yeah.
They're even putting quotes from Andrew Tate in the yearbook. And it turns out she teaches at a classical Christian school. So that was a shock to me that even young Christian men are being drawn in by that highly secular masculine script.
Yeah, and this to me is the fascinating conundrum because I see it even amongst a lot of young Christian men I ministered to. They know Andrew Tate is wrong. They know that he's presenting an anti-Christian worldview, and yet there's something that he's touching on for them which affirms their masculinity when I think all through the rest of life, society's trying to make them feminized men. They're even boys I know that have gone to private, in Australia, church schools where they're only single-sex schools, like boy schools, and the goal is to feminize them. Um, how do you think, in particular, and I think this is, I think, for me, the heart of your book, how does Christianity provide the answer to the extremes there?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to agree with you. I quote in the book, I quote a psychotherapist who writes regularly for the Wall Street Journal.
Mm,
And I thought this was really sad. She said, "The young men coming into my practice these days are all feeling demoralized and defeated because they feel like they're growing up in an environment that is hostile to masculinity." And in my own class at Houston Christian University, when I told my students I was writing a book on masculinity, one of the male students shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." So yes, even Christians are feeling it. And here's I'll give you one more anecdote. So this is another one of my graduate students. She is the leader of the women's ministry at a large Baptist church here in Houston, and she said on Mother's Day we tell the mothers they're wonderful and hand out flowers. On Father's Day we scold the men and tell them to do better. So I think even the church has not figured out a good way to deal with masculinity. I tried very hard. I hope you noticed. I tried very hard not to have a scolding tone in this book. I
yeah,
wanted it to be encouraging,
yeah,
supportive, positive. Uh, um, and what I do several times in the book. Here's what I think is sort of the bigger answer to masculinity. Several times I just go back to the cultural mandate.
mm,
Half my students don't know what that means. So the cultural mandate is Genesis, in the book of Genesis, when God creates the first human couple. So it's pre-fall. So this is giving us the ideal for human life and human nature. God has created a physical universe. He creates the plants. He creates the animals, and then he creates the first human couple. And what is the very first thing he says to them? He says, "Be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth." And in the highly streamlined language of Genesis, we can unpack that because the family, be fruitful is not just the family, but historically, all the social institutions grow out of the family. The extended family becomes a tribe, becomes a village, becomes a nation. And you need social institutions for certain purposes. You need a state, you need a church, you need a school, you need a marketplace. And so it really encompasses all the social institutions. And subdue the earth means harness the natural resources. So it's any work that we do to harness the forces of nature. So, it starts with agriculture, in most civilizations, but goes to mining and technology and inventing computers and composing music. I said that in class one day, and one student said, "What do you mean composing music?" So I play the violin. And so I said, "What's the violin made out of? Wood. What's the bow made out of? Horsehair." So all the transcendent beauty that we associate with music starts with harnessing the raw materials of nature. And I think this is an important message for men, because when they get all these conflicting messages, some of them feminizing, some of them masculinizing, is that a word? Like the Andrew Tate. Go back to Genesis 1 and say, what did God create humans for? It's to roll up. Men are called to roll up their sleeves and get deeply invested, deeply engaged in both the social world, starting with their family, church, and in productive and creative work that, for the glory of God and for the benefit of mankind. So that's where I think we have to start in coming up with a biblical view of masculinity.
Nancy, can I raise another example, but this one from the church? And I kept expecting you to maybe mention this or touch on this in your book, but you didn't. And that's of Mark Driscoll. And because he's been a massive influence here in Australia, particularly the Christianity Today podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. Everybody that I know has listened to it, reflected on it. I'm just wondering, what were your thoughts on that, and particularly as it relates to the issue of masculinity?
Yes, well, I think it's clear that he has picked up his script for masculinity from the Secular Manosphere. Right? So the Manosphere, for people who don't know that term, is a group of online groups that are all men and who are in various ways trying to sort of recreate masculinity by being hyper-masculine. In other words, there's Red Pill, which is taken from the movie The Matrix, or there's Men Going Their Own Way, and that's an actual group that urges men not to marry, not to have relationships, use women just for sex. There's incels. Most of us know about incels because they've been in the news. A couple of incels have committed mass murder, and incels means involuntary celibate. So it's men who can't get a woman to have a relationship with them. And now there's volcels. That's voluntary celibates, men who say, "Well, I don't want women anyway in my life." Anyway, it's very clear that there are Christian men who've gone to the Manosphere and have picked up some of these messages. And here's what I want to say. This book has been very controversial because it's also been jumped on by Christian egalitarians. So Christian egalitarians say, well, what produces the Mark Driscolls of the evangelical world is the theology of male headship. And I quote one woman, for example. She was I quote several, but I'll just give you one. She was a co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement. And she said, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. And so I had a goal of being able to show that actually it's not the theology that drives it. And we can go into some of those studies, to how I prove my point. But what's not driving it is the biblical theology. What's driving it is the secular view of masculinity. I wanted to make the point that when Christians absorb the secular view, that's when we see Christians, who claim an evangelical identity, but who are actually living out a secular script. And I think that's the way to see what's going on with, Christian men who are abusive, or the Mark Driscolls who are essentially parroting the Manosphere, with a few Christian words thrown in. That's one reason we need to read this book. What is the secular script so we can avoid falling into it? That's one of the reasons you have to know secular ideas. Otherwise, you will absorb them without realizing it.
Yeah, and look, Nancy, for me, one of the most important parts of your book, which I was so pleased you pick up on, was the work of the sociologist Bradley Wilcox from the University of Virginia, and also Stephen Tracy. That is just fascinating because I've read those books. I've been deeply engaged in that topic. But for our listeners, do you want to sum up the surprising findings that Wilcox discovered in his research?
Yeah, so I put this right at the beginning of the book because I wanted to start with the good news. I wanted people to get the good news first so they'd be encouraged. And so I put these sociological studies. What happened was, people were saying, secular critics and even many Christian critics were saying that abuse in Christian homes stems from the theology, like I just said. And the social scientists were looking at these accusations and saying, well, where's your evidence? Where's your evidence that theologically conservative men, are, overbearing tyrannical patriarchs? Where's your data? And so the social scientists went out and did the studies, and I quote a dozen or so different studies. And they found that the media narrative was completely wrong, that evangelical men who attend church regularly, who are genuinely committed, test out as the most loving husbands and fathers. Their wives report the highest level of happiness with their husband's love and affection. They are the most engaged fathers in terms of both spending time with their kids, like sports, church youth group, and in terms of discipline, like enforcing bedtime or setting limits on screen time. Evangelical couples have the lowest rate of divorce, 35% lower than the secular world. And the real surprise is they actually have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence. And this information is just not out in the church. It's not out into the public. I had to go digging into the academic literature like you did. I mean, Stephen Tracy writes for academic journals,
Yeah.
and so does Brad Wilcox for the most part. And so I thought, okay, this has to get out into the church into the church to encourage Christian men, but also into the secular realm to help debunk the secular narrative, because this is not just a pep talk from a religious leader. This is solid social science findings. It's empirical, empirically based evidence that Christianity reconciles the sexes, to use the subtitle of my book.
Yeah, and again, I think this was another one of the strengths of the book. Is I love the historical investigation that you make, and the different ways in which, for instance, in history, at certain points, women have been seen as the saviors of men. That they're there to redeem men, which, as you say in your book, really lets men off the hook. It just means that they can become or remain Peter Pan versions of what they should be. They just are adult boys, that have no responsibility. But one of the things that I really enjoyed too was the impact that you talked about with industrialization and the removal of the father from the family. Can you sum up what you found there?
Yeah, so a lot of people think the concept of toxic masculinity grew up maybe in the 1960s, second wave feminism. No. You have to go much further back. You have to go back to the Industrial Revolution. Prior to that, men worked alongside their wives and children all day on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so the cultural expectation was that manhood was defined in terms of caretaking, in terms of responsibility for his family. In fact, this was a surprise. The literature of the day on parenting, like sermons and advice manuals, were addressed to men. Like today, if you go into a bookstore, most of the books on parenting are addressed to women. But back then, they were all addressed to men because men were considered to be the primary parent. And of course, these men were also tough guys because they were making their way in a wilderness. So they had to have the more traditionally masculine virtues as well, like courage and resilience and mastery and so on. But even then, it was not for personal advancement. It was for the sake of their family. So when did this all change? The Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. And of course, men had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And this is when you begin to see a change in the rhetoric, the literature, because people began to protest that men were losing that caretaking ethos that they'd had in the colonial era, that they were beginning to be self-interested and competitive and egocentric and greedy and acquisitive and look out for number one, and turning their career into an idol. This is all, I'm quoting from the literature of the time. And so that's when it was the first time that the language describing the male character began to be negative. And so if we want to know, how do we overcome this, you have to go back to where it started. And obviously we have to then look at ways to reconnect fathers to their children, especially their sons, right? Are there ways even after the Industrial Revolution that we can tweak the workplace and let fathers have more time at home, leave the workplace early some days to coach their soccer team, which was one of my grad students, or work part-time from home. I give lots of stories because you almost have to have anecdotes to see how this might work. But the pandemic was actually a game changer because a lot of fathers, well, I'll quote a New York Times. The New York Times had a headline, and this was not in the book because it came out afterward. But the New York Times had a headline recently, and it was, during the pandemic, many fathers got closer to their children, and they don't want to lose that.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
That's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see ways that we can, tweak the workplace and let fathers and get closer to their families again.
Yeah, if there was a silver lining in COVID, it had to be that, didn't it? The way that we structure our work now, even the fact that, we take up Zoom, we take up a technology to relate to one another, that's a really good thing. The way that we structure our work week, we don't just have to be away from our families, as men in particular, for X amount of hours. We can be more productive by actually spending less physical hours at work. That was, I thought, another really good thing that came out of your book, I think, for me personally. Another little anecdote, and I don't want to call it an anecdote because it's bigger than this, is you have this little section on the daddy brain and how having a child, because I've actually just become recently a grandfather, and I've been struck again. Like I've got 6 children, but my first grandchild's come along, and holding a little baby again, I've noticed it does something in me. It's changing me as a man. It's softening me. It's bringing out things in me that were always there, but just not expressed. And I thought, how many men are missing out on this because we postpone fatherhood? Can you talk a little bit about the impact there, psychologically, even hormonally, on men and raising a family?
Yes, I quoted one psychiatrist who said, society has tended to assume that men get most of their fulfillment, most of their sense of, fulfilled manhood from their careers, and they've understated how much men actually do get a sense of manhood from being fathers. And I'm not averse to appealing to men's self-interest. So I focus on some cool studies, like you mentioned, that show what men get out of becoming fathers. Instead of just saying, you need to do better, let's draw them in by showing them that they benefit as well. And so part of that is, yes, neurobiological. It turns out, well, we all knew that women, when they become mothers, there's a rise in oxytocin. And oxytocin is called the bonding hormone because it creates a sense of attachment. And, women need that little biochemical boost to really attach to this helpless infant who's going to take a lot of time and care. What we didn't know until recently is that men also, the oxytocin is released when they have a baby. It's stimulated by tactile sense, so they have to be actually holding and touching and playing with the baby. So one psychologist, as you noted, called it the dad brain. He said there's a nest of neurons in your brain that don't get activated unless you become a father. So a man actually experiences brain development, brain growth when he becomes a father. And the most recent one is perhaps the most surprising. This came out just before my book did. It was an anthropologist who did a study, and the book is called The Life of Dad. But she found that the man's oxytocin is actually going up during his wife's pregnancy. I guess nobody ever thought to test a man's blood during his wife's pregnancy before. But when they did, they found that all those 9 months, if they're living together, they have to be living together, all those 9 months, the man's oxytocin is going up. So he's being biochemically primed to be a full partner in the parenting team all the way through her pregnancy. So I thought that was a wonderful way of showing that fatherhood, it really is intrinsic to man's nature. You see, I just got accused of this. Somebody who misread the book, I would say, accused me of having what psychologists call a theory of precarious manhood. I didn't even know the term, by the way, but I looked it up and I found out, oh, that is the theory that motherhood is natural to women, but fatherhood is not natural. It's a cultural construction. Well, I had quoted Margaret Mead, who says that. And I had said in the book, she is wrong. So I had actually argued against that view. And it was in the context of what we're talking about here, because clearly God has prepared men, even biochemically, to be involved and engaged fathers. And Jesus himself says that he says, even you who are evil know how to give good gifts to your kids. Even Jesus says, look, you don't even have to be a Christian to be an engaged father. It is part of man's nature. Margaret Mead and all those who follow her, because I did run into it a lot when I was doing my research. That manhood, masculinity, or fatherhood, that this is not really intrinsic to the male character. Yes, it is. God made men this way, and that's why we go back again to the cultural mandate, by the way. Go back to pre-fall.
Margaret Mead is a fascinating example, can I say? And I just had to look up again, and in the very preface of your book, you've got a quote from Margaret Mead, and it says, "The central problem of every society is to define appropriate roles for the men." And I had to take my glasses off, look again and go, what? Margaret Mead has so much to answer for. In fact, I'm sure you've probably heard about the anthropologist in Australia, Derek Friedman, who really exposed her and her research as being fraudulent. But she has so much to answer for in this regard. I want to. It's interesting to me to come back again. I think the tone of the book's lovely because so many books on masculinity. Like there's a very famous feminist here in Australia who it talks about killing all men. And I thought, wow, if men said that the opposite way, there would be untold consequences. I think even more recently, you see the bad behavior of somebody like Russell Brand, who's being really held accountable at the moment for the way he's related to women. But one of the things I really appreciated too about your book is that the whole tone is that the gospel brings hope, that the gospel shows we're both made in the image of God, we're both fallen, and we're both redeemed in the same way through Christ. I guess if you could sum up the book in terms of in one paragraph as in terms of the hope of the gospel, how would you say in your own words the gospel brings redemption to toxic masculinity? How would you express it in your own words, Nancy?
Well, I think one of the problems is something you said earlier, so I'd like to come back to it. When you talked about historically, when women were sort of put on a pedestal, a Victorian pedestal, and said to be morally superior to men, which in a sense let men off the hook. So maybe that we could go back to that, because both of those are wrong. They both need the gospel. So maybe understanding that a little bit better would be good. So when women were put on the Victorian pedestal, first of all, I want to help people realize that this was completely new. No one ever in human history had said that women were superior to men in any way. All the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, people thought that men were morally superior, stronger. The reasoning was that the insight into right and wrong was thought to be a rational insight, and men were thought to be more rational, and therefore men were thought to be more virtuous. In fact, the word virtue comes from the Latin word vir, which means man, as in the word virile. And so up until the 19th century, it was thought that men were morally stronger, more virtuous. And then there was a sudden reversal, and suddenly women were seen to be morally stronger. How did that happen? Well, after the Industrial Revolution, there grew up a very large public realm, right? So factories and businesses and financial institutions and universities and the state. And people began to argue that these large public institutions should be run by scientific principles. by which they actually meant value-free. In other words, don't bring your private values into the public realm, which is what we hear today still. But that's when it started. And so since men were getting that secular education and working in that secular realm, they were becoming secular faster than, earlier than women were. You see it in the literature of the time. Again, people started complaining that men are going to church less often. They're not governing their behavior as much by biblical principles. A lot of the traditionally male vices increased, like gambling and fighting and crime and prostitution. And meanwhile, what was happening with women? Well, if values were kicked out of the public sphere, where will they go? They're into the private sphere, where women still presided. And so this is when women started being considered the morally superior sex. And women were given the task of being the moral guardians of society. And so this is what created a double standard, which seems to still be there today. I mean, what was the Me Too movement? Women calling on men to shape up and calling men immoral. And I think it's in the Christian world as well. I had a chance to be interviewed by a young Christian couple. They were newlyweds. And so I turned the interview around and asked them some questions. I said, what do you think? Do you think that double standard is still part of the church today? And they said, oh, absolutely. Whether dating or marriage, they said, it is just thought that men are more naturally prone to sin and vice, that men are more naturally going to be drawn to porn or other forms of sexual sin. And, that raging beast is always just under the surface, and that it's up to women to hold them in check. It's up to women to hold the line, morally speaking. So I thought, well, if they're right, it sounds like that double standard is in the church still as well.
Yeah, an aspect. I mean, obviously, pornography is massive, particularly with the internet. That's a massive temptation, I think, for men and for women. So many women will come up to me at church and rebuke me for saying, you assume that pornography is a male problem, Mark, but it's just as much a female problem. It may come in different forms at times for them, like through maybe erotic literature, 50 Shades of Grey, or books like Outlander, or, even Game of Thrones, things like that. They will talk about the real draw and in that regard. The other factor I'm seeing too in masculinity and with men, and it's stunting their growth, is gaming. The whole internet gaming culture. That for me is something I think I personally want to investigate more. Had you looked into that yourself, and what did you find?
Well, I think it's about part of the bigger picture of men and boys falling behind. Like a lot of this is young adults, young men who are sitting, the classic stereotype. They're sitting in their mom's basement playing video games, and it's the failure to launch phenomenon. But it starts much earlier. It starts in kindergarten. Boys are falling behind even in kindergarten because they don't have the fine motor control to operate as scissors. And so all through school, from K through 12, boys are falling behind in terms of grades, in terms of extracurricular activities, etc. There are books out with titles like Why Boys Fail, The Trouble with Boys, The Boy Crisis, The War Against Boys. And then same thing in college. I don't know if you know this, but the typical university now is 60% female and 40% male. And more women than men are going to graduate school. More women than men are going to professional schools like law and medicine. And then after school, men are falling behind on a host of measures. Men are more likely than women to commit suicide, to be addicted to drugs and alcohol, to be mentally ill, to be homeless. They're falling behind in employment. It's not showing up in the unemployment numbers because they've stopped looking for work. But so the researchers had to dig a bit deeper, and they tell us that male unemployment is now at Great Depression levels. Great Depression, we think of that as a huge crisis. They're at the same level now. And then life expectancy too. Women's has stayed the same, so it's not a general trend, but men's has gone down in recent years to the point they're I quoted a magazine called The New Scientist, and it said, the major demographic factor today in early death is being male. So I think it's about time we had some compassion on men. Why are they falling behind? Why are they having so much trouble? And should we start some programs that are more directed towards helping men and boys? The girls have had Title IX, and here in the States, we've also had 1994 Gender Equity Act, which poured millions of dollars into helping girls do better in school, equity workshops, special curricula that encourages girls, and so on. There's several times, depending on who you read. I've had 4 times as many scholarships for girls as for boys. Another article said it was 10 times as many. So whatever. We're giving women all these helps, and that's great. We don't want to sound like we think it's bad that women are getting ahead. It's wonderful that women are taking advantage of these opportunities and getting ahead. We have to remember that women were not even accepted into university until about the mid 20th century. So I'm glad I didn't live any earlier. But it is time for us to say, can we do something for boys? Is there time? Is it time to have special, equity workshops for boys and helping them get ahead in school, helping them catch up, helping them fulfill their potential? I read one teacher who put it this way: when girls were behind, we blamed it on the system, on discrimination. Now that boys are behind, we blame it on their masculinity. They're too masculine. They won't sit still. They won't be quiet. And so I thought, well, that's from the teacher's mouth, the attitude that she's seeing in the teachers. And so I think we need to change that. We need to start saying, how can we support, help, and encourage men and boys?
Yeah, well, amen. And that's exactly probably a great place to finish. And I think, can I just say, I think your book is a wonderful way of helping people to understand that issue, or this whole issue, from lots of different perspectives. You can buy it on Amazon. You can also buy it here in Australia at Reformers Bookshop. Nancy, thank you so much for your time and particularly for your work on this. I think it's been a great gift to the church and to the wider community. I hope it gets a wide readership. And I must just say thank you to you for sharing so much of your life. It feels to me like this is something of, if I can say this, a bit of your magnum opus in terms of like coming full circle through your own childhood and the pain and grief of that, working and processing all of that through. And like you're saying, not be bitter, but actually say there's hope. There's hope in God. And particularly, and I think this is really timely from somebody like yourself as a woman who's been abused by a man and a man that should have had her trust, and yet you're providing hope at the end of the day. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. And by the way, and for people who might want to get in touch with me, I have a website also that I'd like to let you know. The address for it is nancypearcey.com, and Pearcey is Pearcey. nancypearcey.com. You can come and browse my other books. You can leave a comment. I read all the comments, even if I don't have time to answer all of them. And thank you so much for your insight into the book. It's been good talking with you, because you're right. So much of this book draws out of my own experience. And like I said, writing from the trenches. So yeah, it has a different feel, I think, to some of my other books because of that.
Yeah, I mean, again, I love I would love anything you write because it's just so well researched. And even at times where I think, I may disagree with you, I'm still edified because I think, that's a really great reference I need to follow up. But I must say, from this book, from the way that you structured the book, I was hooked right from the very beginning. And I thought the fact that you've had the type of childhood you've had, the fact that you've had the kind of trauma that you've had, and this is almost like a personal testimony, as well as using your mind fully to engage with this topic. I just found it riveting from the start. So, yeah, thank you.
And my final word is, you talked about hope. When people do ask me sometimes, but what was the key then to the psychological spiritual healing? It was experiencing God's love. Sometimes it's hard to explain because it seems very simple, but we all know that love heals. Experiencing love from another person is the most healing thing. And if you can work your way to a deep, profound, authentic experience of God's love, that is the greatest healing process of all. God's love heals. And so when you talk about hope, that's the source of hope. If you can work your way, wrestle with God in prayer until you really experience God's love, that's what makes you a new person.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? Because through Christ Jesus, we come into relationship with the perfect Heavenly Father. And while our own fathers, brothers, friends, disappoint us and hurt us deeply, there's healing in the cross, and in the relationship that we have through the cross with the Father. So, well, once again, thank you, Nancy. It's been wonderful to have you come and chat with us. I hope we can chat with you again sometime. Look forward to your next project. I probably shouldn't say that because I think you're going to be busy for quite some time with just this project.
That's true. That's true.
But every blessing to you and your ministry. Oh, this has been Mark Powell for AP's Profiles in Christian Living. I hope you found this interview as fascinating and as stimulating as I have, and I look forward to seeing you next time.